I wanted to like make a companion session and keeping within a stricter time frame of an explanation of the Jewish canon of the Old Testament that I previously did, hoping it would be 14 minutes, and it turned out to be 19. And without the benefit of this layout, which I like to give credit for what I have, this is adapted from uh, an interview that David Noel Friedman, one of the great Bible scholars, gave. For some reason, it's not moving. Um, Gave in a Bible Review many years ago, slightly adapted. So basically, I think it's what he gives in this interview, and I made some adaptations. So again, the Jewish canon of the Old Testament is, I think, really the most theologically significant layout of the Old Testament books that Protestants also accept. That's why I call it the Christian Old Testament. Catholics add some additional books, but both Christian canons and other Christian canons that exist really restructured in a way that I think makes a lot less sense. And I repeat that I think Jesus' canon was, in fact, a Jewish canon, the Torah having been, as they say, canonized early, at least around 400 BCE. And then the prophets, what came to be the second part of the canon, the prophets were finalized around 200 BCE. And the third category that the Jews use, called the Ketuvim, or writings, these were not officially closed as a section with what books were in, what books were out, until probably about 100 CE or AD. Whether it was at Yamnia or some council, that's quite debated. Every time I kind of think about it, I think of all the different debates. I don't want to get into that, but I think it was open in the days of Jesus for sure. And I think that the Gospel of Matthew quotes from the Book of Wisdom, which is a purely Greek work, very late, very close to the time of Jesus, maybe 50 BCE. And so you have that evidence. You have maybe quoting of Enoch in the letter of Jude. Enoch didn't make it into the canon, made it into an Ethiopian canon of the New Testament. And then you have Qumran, where there's no Esther. And you may have other books that the Qumranites, the Essenes, would have included in this. I sometimes have called the writings a catch-all bin, sort of like the third category were things that were late. For example, Daniel got in. And we'll talk about this a little bit. So we're disputing that Daniel was a prophet in Babylon and wrote the whole book. There may have been a prophet in Babylon called Daniel, and he may be responsible for some materials in the early part of Daniel. But certainly, this is a strange book in Aramaic, etc. Most of it, I think, it was baptized in the beginning and in the end by making it in Hebrew. But most of the book is in Aramaic, including the whole Son of Man, great chapter 7. So how do we then review, in a sense, what we said in the Bible in 19.5 minutes, which turned out to be longer than I expected? We have what Friedman and other scholars call the primary history, which you can see here. This would be the Torah, Genesis, or call it creation, to Second Kings, which would be exile. There is a little open door there at the very end where the king, I think Zedekiah, gets invited to eat at the table, etc. But basically, it's a history of failure. So you could say that the first chunk of the Jewish canon, Torah to former prophets, ending with Second Kings. It's a history of failure. In Genesis, you have creation, harmony, paradise, sin, exile from paradise. They wind up in Egypt. Some translations, I think the King James, a coffin in Egypt are the last words of the book of Genesis. And then you have Exodus, they're oppressed. Then they go out to Sinai, as we said, led by Moses, and they arrive in Sinai in Exodus 19. And they're going to be in Sinai till Numbers 10 or 11. And Sinai is a holy mountain. And they are on their way to a second holy mountain, which is called the Mountain of the Amorites. This would be a Deuteronomic name for Canaan, the land of Canaan. So my great professor Norbert Loffing spoke about going from one holy mountain, Sinai, to the mountain of the Amorites, which would be the promised land. Actually, mere arrival in Kadesh Barnea, mere arrival in a southern part of this mountain of the Amorites, as stated in Deuteronomy 1, is already arrival into the mountain of the Amorites. So that the reason that's relevant is because if you read the beginning of Deuteronomy, it's an 11-day journey to go from Mount Horeb, which is their name for Mount Sinai. The Deuteronomist's name for Mount Sinai is Horeb. And when they arrive at the mountain of the Kadesh Barnea, they've already arrived at their destination, except they have to take the land. And that's what they are afraid to do and refuse to do. They've sent spies. The spies scare them as to the giants in the land. We look like ants. This is a land that devours its inhabitants, which is considered slander by Ezekiel and by Numbers, slander against the land. The land is almost like a person, really. Ezekiel addresses the land and the mountains as a person, apostrophizes, in other words, so that this 11-day journey turns into a 38-year going around a mountain, wasting time, which I relate to the paralytic in John 5. But continuing then, they arrive in Sinai in Exodus 19. There they get the 10 Commandments. They break them immediately with the golden calf, or I mentioned golden calves. If you read back the Jeroboam incident in 1 Kings 12, they build 2 golden calves at the upper north and southern points of the northern separated kingdom. And they say, these are your gods. And so you have that reflected in Exodus 32 with these golden. If you look at the text in Hebrew, it actually refers in plural to calves. So that the 10 Commandments, the covenant is broken immediately, which means that there has to be a new covenant. And this is what Deuteronomy 29 is going to be about, a separate covenant from that made in Horeb, a separate covenant made in Moab. And I guess we could talk about that on some other occasion, because there is a lot of, we say in Spanish, cloth from which to cut. So that they're in the holy mountain, they break it, but they're still there. Leviticus is the central book of the Pentateuch. It's the manual for priests, Torat HaKohanim, they call it in Jewish. And I say it's the rules for what you do when God is in your presence as a radioactive force. Incredibly beneficial if well harnessed and respected, etc. If dealt with the wrong way, you are zapped. The middle of Leviticus is Yom Kippur, Leviticus 16, in my opinion, and that of others. Other scholars like Milgram, great Leviticus Jewish scholars, dispute that. But I think Leviticus 16, Yom Kippur, is the center. And as I said, the scholars attribute the first 15 chapters to a ritualistic old priestly school, very old, but that ritual cultic approach to the neglect of social justice resulted in all the prophetic lambasts that we read about from Isaiah on, and Amos and Hosea for sure, and Micah and all the prophets, that they neglected social justice, relying on the temple of Yahweh, temple of Yahweh, temple of Yahweh, as Jeremiah 7 says, so that this priestly school adapted and changed and began to include social justice concerns and the ethics demanded by the land. And in priestly fashion, the land will vomit you, just like it vomited out the Canaanites if you pollute it with your sins. And there's no repentance. It's like a hangover. You could be sorry you drank too much, and the next day you got a hangover for 24 hours. In the priestly version, it probably took 49 years of exile before Israel got over its hangover. So that Yom Kippur is in the center. I'll quote a deceased Jewish Bible scholar, University of Chicago, a great woman. I had the pleasure of hearing her, Tikva Freimer-Kensky, who said that what the high priest wore on Yom Kippur was a holiness hazard suit, because he's going into the center of the radioactive presence of the Lord. So that's very interesting. And so then, like I said, the chapter 17 to 26, or I think there's a 27th additional chapters, that those are ethical chapters: love your neighbor as yourself, sexual rules, etc. And then, like I said before, when they leave Sinai in Numbers 10 or 11, everything breaks down. And really, a whole generation has to pass, including Moses and Aaron. They do not enter. Only these two new guys, Joshua and Caleb, a pagan joined to Israel, enter the promised land, but not after Deuteronomy is finished, which is a hinge book that is a sort of ending to the Torah. It's the final fifth book. They could have ended with Joshua with a happy ending. They conquer the land and divide the land into the tribes and everybody's happy, but that would be a false happy ending, because the rest of the story is they go into exile at the end of Kings. So Deuteronomy is purposely placed as a book of non-ending, where they are waiting to enter the land and are stuck in a way in this land of Moab, a very impure land, where they have a final blowout in Numbers 25. I mentioned that. And so Moses gives a series of speeches and then dies. And it says that no prophet has risen again in Israel like Moses. I insist that it should be translated not yet, but I know many others prefer never again. So I'll leave it at that. I think this odd word in Hebrew is really a yet more than anything. Of course, in Christianity, Jesus would be this prophet like Moses that arises. Acts 2:32 and 33, I think it is, talks about that. And of course, in some version of this, Jeremiah was the prophet like Moses, who warned of the exile. He's got a 40-year ministry. He's a youth, can't speak. Yahweh puts his words in his mouth, etc. So, as I said, these are things that we can discuss on other occasions. Followed by Deuteronomy following Deuteronomy, the former prophets, the conquest to the exile. And I'll repeat the verses in 2 Kings 25, verse 26. Some editor has inserted that they all went back to Egypt, which is not literally true. Some went. Jeremiah was maybe kidnapped and taken to Egypt. And there was an important colony in Egypt probably already. But most went to Babylon. We know that. At least the upper classes are skilled people. They left behind the poorest to till the soil, etc. But this is very symbolic by the editor. The curse in Deuteronomy 28:69, I repeat from the prior session. was fulfilled. You will all go back to Egypt in ships, and this time you'll try to sell yourselves as slaves. No one will buy. Then comes the new covenant in Moab in Deuteronomy 29. Not until today did you have ears to hear, eyes to see, etc., heart to know, etc., which is again something for some other occasion. We're trying to deal with the canon here. And so then after this halftime, they're losing the game badly. I'm not a football fan, but I know enough to be able to say that. The pep talks that I mentioned last time, these great prophets, Ezekiel in the early part of the exile, the Deuteronomists are also very active. Two different schools that will merge their ideas, which we'll talk about some other time. Then come the latter prophets, who are prophets that began way back with Amos and Hosea in the 8th century, and Isaiah of Jerusalem and Micah in the same 8th century, two in the north, two in the south. And then others emerge, and they're all put together as a 3+12 pattern. The three great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, plus a scroll wherein, as I said, 12 prophets fit. And maybe Malachi is really my messenger, a name they came up with based on the contents, but it was one of these Massa, oracles floating around that was put into the 12, or made into a 12 book, just as these Massa oracle sections of Isaiah, Zechariah 9 and Zechariah 11, these are chunks that were added to Zechariah, and you come up with 12, we call them minor prophets. And I see that time flies when you're having fun, so I'm at 17 minutes. It's going to match the other one, but at least it's a sort of a repetition and an explanation and clarification, I hope. The third category, the writings, as I said, the Psalms is a 5-book work, so it's sort of parallel to the first book, or to the first unit, which is the Torah. And it ends with Chronicles, and I see that the King James has it, let him go up, Ya'al in Hebrew, one word. And that's very significant because it's a sign of hope that you're going back to the Holy Land, where you always go up and you go to the temple, the presence of God, when this temple is rebuilt. And this is a hope for Jews and a hope for Christians. So as I said, I've laid it out. You can look at it. It really doesn't match completely because the writings are a third category that Christians mix up with historical books or other writings or whatever they call it. And it's very nice. It ends with Malachi, maybe turn the page and you're with John the Baptist in Matthew, maybe after the genealogy or something like that. But nevertheless, I think that the Jewish canon is the one that has the theological significance, certainly for Jews, and I think for Christians too. And I think it was the Bible Jesus used. I repeat, all the blood from Abel to Zechariah would be all the blood from Genesis to 2nd Chronicles. And also, I called it the Emmaus story. It's not really the Emmaus story. It's after the Emmaus story in Luke 24:44. Jesus refers to a 3-part Bible. The law, the prophets, and the Psalms. He calls them the Psalms, being the first book, and an indication that they haven't even come up with a name, perhaps, even though there are other parts of the Old Testament, especially in Ben Sirah and maybe Maccabees, that seem to refer to a three-part Bible in Judaism. I'm going to stop there. I went over 19 again, same time as before, so I'm sorry. That's what it takes, I guess.